Now that you're comfortable sewing t-shirt material, let's go ahead and sew our t-shirt quilt top. So let's start with our map and our first roll. I'm going to be working on this section right here. This is section 1. So I'm going to unroll my blocks and look for sew downs. A sew down is any sewing that needs to be done on a block before it's sewn into the quilt. For example, sewing a neckline down. And I do have one right here. This collar is actually 2 pieces right here, and I need to sew this collar down. So I have matching blue thread in my machine right now, and I'm simply going to sew along the collar. All right, so that's sewed down, I'm ready. And I have one other sew down. It will be on this shirt. And I'm just going to do this in the white thread that I'm going to sew the top together in. So I grab my shirt, and again, I simply sew the collar down onto the backing piece, right on the seam allowance. All right, there we go. So now that I have my sew downs finished, I want to decide where I want to begin on my map. And I've decided I want to sew these 2 blocks here first. It's a very easy seam. Here's the red block. And there is a block right here. It's a blank block, it's navy, and it's an 8 by 4. Now I want to make sure that I have this right side up and not upside down. Once I know I have it right side up, place your good sides together. Line up your corners. Then you line up your bottom corners. Match your seams. And there you have that. So those 2 blocks are done. I need to sew these 2 blocks to this block. And this is that block. As you notice, this block is 4 inches longer than this block here. So I'm going to sew from here to about halfway through this 8 by 4, and I'm going to stop here. This is my first half seam. So I fold the good sides together and line things up. If you get interrupted or for any reason are not quite sure if you've picked it up right, go back and check. Sometimes you can check after you put your presser foot down. That'll hold it. Take a peek, make sure, okay, I do have the right blocks hooked together. It'll save you a lot of time double checking now rather than having to go back and pull stitches out. Start sewing the beginning. Now this block that I'm sewing to the red block has 2 layers, so I need to make sure I get both the top and the bottom layer inside the seam allowance. So I'm watching for that as I sew. All right, there I have stopped partway down the seam. So when I open this up, you'll see the seam stops right about there. So I've got these 3 pieces now. Next, I've got to come to this area. I'm going to put these 2 blocks together first with a half seam right there, and then sew it to this blue block. Okay, so this is this block right there. This is this block, and then we have the blue block right there. So this is going to be a half seam. I'm going to sew just a little bit. So you lay it out and then you fold it over and pay attention that you're sewing the right spot. Because if you pick it up and sew here, you're going to be sewing the wrong spot. You've got to make sure you sew it in the right spot. Grab your strings. Start sewing. There is another half seam. So I've sewed halfway through that block. But now I have these 2 blocks together allow me to sew this block on. So there we are. One of the things you can do is you can check your measurements to make sure everything's measuring out right. We use 4 1/4 inch tape measures. I can measure from here to here, and I know that should measure 4 inches and 1/4. So I put my tape measure on, and it measures perfectly. Double check all my blocks are in right side up. So now I can go on, and I'm going to sew this block next, because I'm going to sew this seam right there. It will be a half seam right there, which is this spot. So I find this piece right here. Again, this has two layers here on this shirt, so I want to make sure I get both layers in there. I line it up, and then I flip it over, and I grab and I kind of pinch so I remember which way I want to sew down, which side I want to sew. So I line everything up, grab my thread, sew the seam. And then I stop before I get to the end of the short piece. So I flip that open, and then let's look at your seam. Make sure that you caught it all. And I have, and it looks great. So now with these two pieces put together, I can add in the last piece in the section, and that's that big bird. So again, take your time, look, make sure they're both right side up, and fold it over, and pay attention to where you're going to grab it so you can sew the right side of the block. Now I'm being very careful through here because you can see that these two pieces, these two layers of this block have kind of shifted. So I really need to pay attention and make sure that they line back on top of each other. Open up your seam, check your seam, make sure that you've caught everything. And the last thing we need to do in this section is add this section that we made first. All right, so we've got the thread out here, and we're going to hook to here. So you've got two choices. If you sew here, you'll have to stop. If you sew this seam, you're going to have to stop because it doesn't go all the way down. So I'm going to actually sew this seam right here, just 4 to 6 inches on this seam, and then this seam will be completable. So I'm going to take this and fold it over and carefully pick it up. I'm going to line up my corner. Again, I've got this block which has 2 layers, so I have to be really careful and catch all those layers. So I'm just going to go a little bit, and then I'm going to reline up my layers because they want to slip and slide on me. So I've sewed halfway down that green block. Now that allows us to complete this seam, which was a half seam originally. It allows us to complete this entire seam, and that'll complete the section. So I'm going to sew from the outside towards this seam. You'll notice that I'm letting the machine pull the material through. I'm not stretching back here, I'm not stretching here. I'm just letting the machine feed itself. I overlapped onto the first part of the seam that we did, and now the seam is finished. So let's look at this section here. Still have a pin in it. I want to check that seam I just did and make sure I caught everything. And it looks like I did. That's our first section. Next, we can go on and complete section 2. All right, we've got section 1 and section 2 completed. I tell you, this is really fun because it goes fast. So now we need to put section 1 and section 2 together. So I have it laid out here, and you can see there's a half seam here and a half seam there. So I'm going to do the following seams. I'm going to sew from here to here. This will finish this seam and allow this seam to attach. Then I will sew from here to here, and that'll complete this half seam. So let's start with this seam right here. When you have such a big section, I suggest laying them out and then gently folding your sections over on top of each other so you can line up your seam. So I'm going to sew from here down to here. I'm going to grab that with my hand, gently shake it out, and then I can sit down and begin to sew. All right, so now we're going to sew this seam, and we're going to sew it just like we would any other seam. But we also kind of need to be aware that as your quilt gets bigger, it'll get heavier and it'll want to pull more. So you just have to really watch that the quilt does not pull. All right, so let's open this up and see where we are. So we completed this seam, and now we can complete this seam here. So again, I'm going to carefully fold this over and line up where I want to start. I'm going to pinch it in my fingers so I know where I'm going to sew. And then I can sit down and sew. All right, so we've completed that seam, and we can open this back up. So now we have one more seam to do. So this was our first seam, this was our second seam, and now this is our third seam. Again, I'm going to fold over and grasp the area I want to sew, kind of let the rest of the quilt shake out, and then I can line my seam up. You have the choice of sewing towards your half seam or away from your, starting at your half seam and going out or out going in. It doesn't matter. Right, so that should be the final seam in the first half of your quilt. Let's open this up and take a look at it. All right, so we did this seam, then this seam, and now this seam. So now this first half is completed, and you can put it away until you finish your second half. All right, we have finished our quilt top. You can take a little time to look at it, but I would suggest waiting until we get to the next step. Our next step will be to put a temporary binding on the quilt, and that'll allow you to handle the quilt without having to worry that it's going to stretch out.